Time now for 3 to watch when we check out where the big stories will be headed this week.
He shot her more than once.
He's not a monster.
He's still a young man. He can still come back in a year or so's time.
I think his career is pretty much over.
I am!
We know who killed Trayvon Martin.
We just wanted an arrest.
Justice! Has ignited all the racial tensions that we've had here for years.
What's your favorite Canadian movie?
That's a good question.
The Barbarian Invasion. Well, it's Quebecois, right?
Tonight, 3 big stories and 3 panelists. David Simmons is a senior communications strategist. Adam Goldenberg is a human rights fellow at Yale Law School and a former Liberal speechwriter. And Jonathan Kay edits the comment section at the National Post. So let's get started with our first big story this week.
Don't do something or start something unless you're going to finish it, and don't do something unless you're going to give it 100%.
Small wonder Nike sponsored Oscar Pistorius, a.k.a. the Blade Runner. He blazed a burning 400-meter trail at the Olympics and around the world. But now that he's been charged in the murder of his girlfriend, he's a fallen icon and a tainted brand. The case against him isn't ironclad. So the question is, will his fame help or hurt him in court? So, David, you're the PR expert here. We'll start with you. What do you think? Will his celebrity status help him or not?
I think that the starting point for someone in this position is to take themselves out of the celebrity position and create an environment of fair and reasonable when you're talking about these sorts of things. And I think that he's done that a little bit. You want to be open. You want to be transparent. You want to define the situation and the way you're perceived before critics and opposition can define you. So it'll be interesting to see whether he can maintain that level of credibility for his side of the story as the legal proceedings go forward.
The sponsors are being somewhat wary, but some fans are sticking by him, Jonathan, and he has been granted bail. What do you think? Is his celebrity status helping him?
I think the only way it can help him is if he actually wins the case, obviously. But people like a story of someone overcoming adversity, and this obviously is the most lurid and horrible type of adversity possible. So if he beats the case, if he makes a convincing argument that somehow his motives were non-criminal, then maybe he can make a comeback if he starts winning races. The only problem is, even if he does that, he will still be the guy who shot his wife. And his defense itself will rest on the idea that he is a somewhat unstable and paranoid figure. And this is part of his case history, is that, I think he shot a gun in a restaurant once. So even if he wins the case, his reputation will be that of a somewhat unstable individual. And it's hard for that kind of person.
So far in the case, what do you think?
Well, I agree with John that people do like stories about people overcoming adversity, but Oscar Pistorius already wrote that narrative. Now he's fallen from grace. He went from glorious to notorious in record time. And we're left with Pistorius, who here we are on the other side of the world, talking about how he shot his girlfriend. And I think that there is no way that he will ever be anything other than the great guy who shot his girlfriend. And whether he's acquitted or not, it's going to be very hard for the prosecution, by the way, to find impartial jurors. So the fact that he's famous might actually hurt his chances of being acquitted unless there's a bench trial, in which case there are public pressures around this that are still in play there. I don't think he comes back from this, Wendy.
It's almost turned into another OJ. I can't even imagine more angles to the story. We're hearing today about the brother. There was the investigator who's being investigated.
Well, if you use OJ as the past and it's prologue to the situation, then he can come back, because we saw a watershed of support. And there were issues of race and whatnot on the OJ trial, but OJ had people support him and insist that he was innocent until proven guilty. So despite all of these variables, I think it'll be interesting for us to see whether that narrative can be reconstructed.
So something special for sports heroes in our hearts, do you think, John?
Oh, absolutely. Lance Armstrong, Tiger Woods, Kobe Bryant. I mean, these aren't all on the same level in terms of criminality or what they did. But people love their heroes, and they like to keep their heroes on a higher moral plane. And it's very difficult to dislodge them from that hero status.
There's a higher moral plane, and then there's shooting your girlfriend. I mean, and he's admitted that he did shoot
Michael Vick came back.
his girlfriend.
Look at Michael Vick. He's a guy who killed dogs. And somehow he made it back to the NFL. If a guy who kills dogs can do it, it's perverse to say, but somehow in our society, somehow killing animals to some people is just as bad as killing humans. If he can make it back to the NFL.
I don't think that's a mainstream position, and I wouldn't want to draw conclusions from Vick's experience.
For sports fans, you can never tell.
Well, we'll be watching that one. Here's another one, story number 2.
If Trayvon Martin were standing
and George Zimmerman was on the ground dead, would Trayvon Martin been arrested?
That question consumed America after 17-year-old Trayvon Martin was shot dead by Florida Neighborhood Watch Captain George Zimmerman. Zimmerman said he acted in self-defense and was only charged with murder after months of nationwide protests. Trayvon's hoodie became a symbol of racism in America. This week, for the one-year anniversary, a million hoodie march is planned in New York. We've watched all of this from a comfortable distance, but is Canada really immune to a Trayvon-style tragedy? Or do we need our own million hoodie march? What do you think, Jonathan? Are we better than them on this question?
The idea that we're better than the Americans is a favorite theme of Canadian media. I don't think we're better, but we certainly are less race-obsessed. If you look at the United States, every single major issue is colored by race. In the aftermath of the 2012 election, people did their analysis by race. They said, well, Romney won 60% of the white vote, but Obama won blacks, Hispanics, Asians, Jews. The gun control issue has a racial aspect to it. Obviously, crime and punishment. Immigration is a huge racial issue. So it's very difficult to find an issue in the United States that doesn't have a major racial component. So when you do have some flashpoint like this, it brings the entire political world of that country into focus.
David, are we beyond racism here?
I don't think we are. I think that there's definitely a culture, whether it's silent, of racism in Canada. Comparing the American experience to the Canadian one, though, is, I think, it doesn't give tribute or honor to the American experience. The African-American community has a very unique experience, a shared narrative, institutionalized exclusion and oppression that's unique to that nation. The black experience in Canada is much different, and so while we experience racism, I think it's experienced in a different way and requires it. Black Canadians are very different. They come from different places. They speak different languages.
But you've experienced racism.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I've experienced it silently and actively. I showed up to a wedding and asked for the name of the groom, and the hostess asked if that gentleman was working in the kitchen that evening, which is, and I don't say that to make myself seem like I have some cross to bear that's different than other people of minority status, but it's here, it's alive in this country, and I don't know that we talk about it enough. Maybe we need to give some space to what race means in Canada.
What do you think, Adam?
I think Canadians are too often smug about comparisons to the United States, as John said. In the United States, there's an overpopulation, an overrepresentation, I should say, of black males in the prison system. In Canada, Aboriginal people make up less than 4% of the population and almost 20% of the prison population. Women, Aboriginal women, make up almost a third, in fact, over a third, I think, of the female prison population in this country. Schools were desegregated in the United States in the 1950s and 1960s. The last residential school in Canada closed in the 1990s. And we saw with Idle No More, there is an unacknowledged angst among many Indigenous people in Canada.
So we're more racist?
No, I wouldn't say more. I'd say that there's a different history. It's not the same, and we don't want to draw comparisons where they aren't appropriate. But to pretend that Canada doesn't have a history of racial dislocation is wrong.
I agree with Adam. There is similarities between the First Nations Aboriginal experience and the black experience, but it's different. And I think we need to give a unique attention to the Aboriginal experience.
That's a good point.
Yeah, if I could just jump in, one of the defining qualities of the American experience with race is it's also a story of redemption. If you look at some of the great figures like Obama, if you look at Lincoln, you look at every major city has Martin Luther King honored in some way, Jackie Robinson. There's all these heroes, and so Americans are also very proud of the way
of progress.
The progress they've made. And so when something like the Trayvon Martin incident comes along, it's not just racism, it's also a deflation of all this pride that they have. So I think that's one of the factors.
Last point.
I just think that there's the intra-community conflict in America as well. Remember that when Obama was nominated, there were questions from within the black community as to whether he was black enough. So the politics of identity are very different.
We've got to move on. Story number 3. This is War Witch, the third Quebec film in as many years to receive an Oscar nod. English-Canadian film has fared far worse. There are tons of Canadian A-listers in Hollywood. Canadian actors, directors, and locations are American film fixtures. So when it comes to making our own movies, why the Oscar drought? You were afraid I was going to ask this question. I want all of you to name your top 5 English-Canadian movies. Anyone got any?
I don't think we have enough time for me to get through all the reasons why I love English-Canadian film.
I assume the Star Wars films were all Canadian, right?
They were?
Yeah, okay, that's it.
Do you have any Canadian English films that you've been to see and love?
Well, my favorite Canadian English movie I saw with you, Wendy, so why don't you tell Canadians what the name
I saw Denny Kravitz 25 years ago.
I don't think it's fair to phrase the question that way, with all respect, because, you know, Ryan Gosling is Canadian. James Cameron is Canadian.
So that counts?
Sure, of course it does. These are some of the most talented Canadians there are, and they're doing well in Hollywood, and good for them. They're doing well as Canadians, and I don't think that's something for us to be ashamed of. Quebec has always had a particular film culture, and a wonderful film culture, which is sustained by a minority language community in an English-speaking continent. But there are also policy factors here as well that we can't ignore. In Quebec, the Quebec government's Council for the Arts spends roughly double per capita what the Canada Council for the Arts does in supporting the work of artists across the country.
So, Jonathan, should the Canadian government then invest in Canadian film production?
No, I don't think so. I think the best bang for your cultural buck comes from radio, documentaries, that sort of thing. The problem now with blockbuster filmmaking is it's basically you're making $100 million cartoons. And I know all about that because I have young kids, so every movie I see is animated.
But what, it's a lost cause?
Well, it's not a lost cause, but if you want to protect our culture, I'd say, you know, making Monsters, Inc., or Wreck-It Ralph, or Toy Story, that's not really bang for your buck in terms of culture. That's just an industry like any other industry. I'd say that there are other media that offer better representation for what we consider Canadian culture.
But it's worked in music, why not?
Well, I think we're the fly on the elephant in this equation, and we shouldn't try to lead from a position that's not our strength. We're always competing with Hollywood. We're always competing with this massive industry in the U.S. The Quebec film industry is unique. We should be acknowledging that, promoting it. And Adam has a point. I think some of the best comics came out of Canada, and we're very proud of those comics. And I think of people like Tina Fey, who actually came to Toronto to train at Second City before she went back to the States.
We've got to wrap up in just a sec, but maybe would Ben Affleck say thanks Canada if he wins something?
Oh, yeah, we'll see. Now that Jimmy Carter's waded into it, I think that basically does it for Ben Affleck.
They tell our stories. They have our stars, our directors. Someday.
But remember, CanCon on the radio, Justin Bieber is CanCon, Carly Rae Jepsen is CanCon. I don't think they pay taxes in Canada, but they're Canadian, and we should be proud of them for it.
We are out of time. Thanks so much, guys. It was fun.